They called it the Eternal City. For more than 800 years, no foreign enemy had ever set foot within the walls of Rome. To the people living inside, the empire wasn't just a government. It was the world itself. It was the air they breathed. It was the only version of reality that existed for as far back as any living memory could reach. It took 1,000 years to build the most sophisticated civilization the Western world had ever seen. 1,000 years of law, engineering, and conquest. 1,000 years of convincing themselves they could never fall. And then it all ended in a single morning. August 24th, 410 AD, the heat in the city was stifling, but the temperature wasn't the problem. For 2 years, Alaric and his Visigoths had sat outside the walls. Rome, the city that once commanded the Mediterranean and dictated the fate of millions, was now a cage. Inside, the Eternal City was eating itself. Gold had lost its value because there was no grain to buy. The aristocrats were reduced to eating their prized horses, and the poor were found scavenging for grass between the paving stones of the Forum. Rumors of cannibalism rippled through the streets like a cold wind. A centurion named Quintus walked the Salarian gate. He was hungry, his belt tightened to the last possible notch to keep his armor from sliding off his thinning frame. As he looked out over the battlements, the weight of the last 1,000 years felt like a physical burden on his shoulders. He wore the same style of helmet his ancestors had worn when they defeated Hannibal. He carried a blade forged in the tradition of the legions that had conquered Gaul and Britain. But the men carrying those swords today weren't the iron-willed legions of Caesar. They were ghosts. They were tired. And deep down, they knew the secret the Senate in its marble halls refused to admit. Rome was already dead. It just hadn't stopped moving yet. How do you lose a millennium in a morning? You start by losing it slowly over 2 centuries. While Quintus stood guard, the foundation beneath his boots had been rotting for generations. The empire had become too big to manage, too expensive to defend, and too corrupt to care. The barbarians weren't just at the gates. They were the army. By 410 AD, Rome relied on the very people it looked down upon to defend its borders. The Visigoths outside weren't strangers. Many had served in the Roman legions themselves. They knew the tactics. They knew the weaknesses. And they knew that the Emperor Honorius was a coward hiding in the marshes of Ravenna, more concerned with his pet chickens than the fate of his capital. Taxation had long ago crippled the middle class. Inflation had turned the currency into worthless scrap metal. The spirit of the Roman citizen had been replaced by a heavy, suffocating apathy. When you have everything for 1,000 years, you forget that everything can be taken away. You begin to believe that the walls are a natural law, like the rising of the sun. Midnight came to the Salarian gate in total silence. History still debates who did it. Some say it was a group of starving slaves who wanted the siege to end at any cost. Others say it was a Roman noblewoman who believed a quick surrender was more merciful than a slow death by famine. But it doesn't matter who pulled the lever. What matters is the sound of the heavy iron bolt being drawn back. What matters is the creak of the massive wooden doors swinging open from the inside. The silence broke in a heartbeat. For the first time in 8 centuries, the gates of Rome were open to an invader. As the sun began to rise on the morning of August 24th, the 1,000-year morning arrived. This wasn't a battle of grand strategies or heroic stands. It was an execution. The Goths flooded in, not as a mindless horde, but as a disciplined force that knew exactly where the wealth was hidden. Quintus was pushed back into the streets as the city woke up to a nightmare. He saw the Forum, the center of the civilized world, being picked apart like a carcass. He saw Goth soldiers throwing golden statues into carts and stripping the silver from the altars. The Goths didn't burn the city to the ground because they didn't have to. They simply took what they wanted and broke the rest. They stripped the gold from the roof of the temple of Jupiter. They dragged the icons of the gods into the mud of the streets. For 3 days the city bled. But the real damage wasn't the property or the gold. It was the psychological collapse of an entire species. Across the sea in Bethlehem, the great scholar St. Jerome heard the news and wept. He wrote that the city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. If Rome could fall, what was safe? If the 1,000-year empire could vanish in a morning, then the very concept of forever was a lie. The morning of the fall didn't just end a government. It ended a way of life that had defined the human experience for centuries. The complex trade networks that brought silk from China and grain from Egypt vanished overnight. The roads that connected Britain to Baghdad began to crumble as the men who maintained them were killed or fled. Within a single generation, the people living in the ruins of Rome would forget how to make the very concrete their houses were built of. They would look at the massive aqueducts and believe they were the work of giants or gods, unable to fathom that their own grandfathers had once operated them. This is the true terror of that morning. It's not just the violence of the sack. It's the realization of how fragile civilization actually is. We like to think of progress as an upward staircase, an inevitable climb toward better things. But Rome proves that progress is a tethered balloon. If the rope snaps, it doesn't just drift. It falls with terrifying speed. When the Goths finally marched out of the gates 3 days later, they left behind a shell. The population of Rome, which had once exceeded 1 million people, would eventually drop to just 20,000. The grand villas became slums. The marble theaters became quarries for stone. Sheep began to graze in the forum where emperors once decreed the laws of the world. Today we walk through the forum and see beautiful piles of stone. We see history in a textbook. But to the people who lived through that morning, it wasn't history. It was the end of the world. We live in an age that feels as permanent as Rome did in its prime. Our networks are global. Our empire is digital. We have built a millennium of technology and law, and we tell ourselves it cannot happen here. We tell ourselves we are different, that our foundations are made of something stronger than Roman brick. But every empire believes it is the exception. Every civilization thinks its morning will last forever. Quintus sat on a broken column as the sun rose on a city that was no longer his. He took off his helmet and looked at the horizon, realizing that the world he was born into had disappeared while he was standing guard. The fall of Rome didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the result of 1,000 years of choices, of small rot ignored and grand arrogance embraced. And when the bill finally came due, it was paid in full in a single morning. The road to victory for the enemies of the state was paved by the state itself. The lesson of the ruins is that nothing is earned forever. Every generation must decide if it is willing to do the work to keep the gates closed, or if it will be the one to pull the lever in the middle of the night.